Well, welcome once again to the Reed and Christine Halliday Executive Lecture Series. Today we have a special treat. Just recently, and this has kind of not even been announced yet, but we have engaged Dr. Kelly Matthews as a professional in residence here in the Woodbury School at Utah Valley University. The Professional in Residence program recognizes great professionals who have had a large impact on the state of Utah and the surrounding region, and brings them here on campus to teach a course. Dr. Matthews will be teaching next semester, and to be engaged in other ways in other classrooms. And so Dr. Kelly Matthews is actually the very first professional in residence at UVU, and so we're excited to have him in the Woodbury School. Let me give you just a little bit of background. I'll be quick on this. He's humble, but he also has a lot of material to get through, so I won't give you everything. But Dr. Matthews was previously the Executive Vice President and economist at Wells Fargo and Company. He joined them in 2000 when First Security Corporation merged with Wells Fargo, and he served as First Security's chief economist for 27 years. He started his economics career with Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, New York, and was responsible for international forecasting from 1968 to 1970. He's also taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Utah for many years. He has a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in economics from BYU, and he earned his PhD in economics from the University of Colorado in Boulder. He's participated in a number of local and national commissions and committees dealing with bankers and economists throughout the years, and I won't go ahead and list all of those, but he's played significant roles both at the local and national level. He has been responsible at Wells Fargo for government affairs, and his research and opinions have been widely shared throughout the state of Utah. If you ask bankers in the state of Utah and many other folks in the state of Utah who kind of gives them the economic forecast that they depend on, many of them would say Dr. Kelly Matthews. And so without further ado, Dr. Kelly Matthews.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where your watch says it is at the moment. I'm really happy to be here with you today. Particularly pleased, as the Dean indicated, that I'll be able to spend some time on this campus regularly. I'm looking forward to that very much and appreciate that opportunity greatly. I know that each of you picked up a little sheet as you arrived in, and we certainly want to spend a few moments talking to you about what may be going on in understanding not only why we are as we are in the economy, but what maybe is why that is affecting the elections and all the things that you've heard about that. But first of all, it was suggested, and I agreed, that maybe by chance over those 37 years in the bank, maybe I observed or saw or experienced a few things that may be of interest to you. And so let me just quickly tick off 4 items that may surprise you, which I believe will be very important in terms of the successful careers that hopefully each one of you will embark on. And I think that learning these things early and then practicing them will be really important. These are those 4 items that I want to talk with you about. First of all is reliance and self-confidence. Secondly is speaking and verbal communication. 3 is simply being able to write clearly and effectively. And 4th, what is it that we actually mean by hard work? Before I embark on those, I wanted to reassure each of you how strongly I feel that you are spending yourself here. The very best time you can invest is the time that you spend here, and hopefully many of you will continue your education in any number of different venues. But I probably would have remained as a sheep herder and cowboy, which I was for the first 18 years of my life, indefinitely if I hadn't had the opportunity to have an education experience. And so I hope that each one of you are making the most out of this opportunity to be here, and I would urge you to do so. Okay, what do we mean by having self-reliance and self-confidence? Actually, what I'm suggesting there is simply knowing who we are, where we are going, and how we plan to get there. If you have that feeling or that knowledge or that confidence that emanates from within yourself, it will be a huge benefit in terms of how you achieve and how you accomplish the things that you have. Just as maybe a tiny little anecdote, personal anecdote on these items, as it was mentioned, I grew up on a ranch in Bear Lake, and maybe by the time I was 10 years old, being the youngest family of two families which had our ranch together, I was the youngest son of all of them. By the time I was 10 years old, it was not at all uncommon that I would be sent on a tractor or on horses to do anything that a man's work might be. And I'm sure that many times I didn't do it perfectly, but never once did my dad criticize me or belittle me in terms of the way in which I did that. And I think that experience and the way in which I received additional responsibility and learned the lesson that if we accept responsibility and magnify that responsibility, we actually end up achieving greater freedom, more freedom. I learned that early, and it enabled me very much to benefit over those 37 years in banking. One last thing in that area I would mention to you is that obviously out where I was, there was no such things as television at that time. We had one little old radio, which was usually so staticky that I couldn't hear anything. So most of the time, I learned when I wasn't with my dad, I did things alone. And when I had the things that I'd been assigned to do completed, I read, and I read, and I read more, because that's mainly what there was to do. And so I'm urging you very much to spend as much time as you can reading rather than what so many of us do with our spare time right now. Second, number two is, what do I mean by speaking and verbal communication? What I'm really talking about here is that being able to speak effectively and communicate is the key to influencing, altering, motivating, convincing, inducing action in other people. As it turns out, particularly in today's business world, we're all selling all the time. We're either selling ourselves, we're selling the institution, maybe we're selling a particular product. The way in which we achieve that is through our ability to speak and to communicate, as it were, to affect other people's actions. My anecdote relating to this is that I happened to serve an LDS mission, and my mission president was Stephen R. Covey. Maybe some of you have heard of him. It turns out, as maybe some of you realize, that maybe he is one of the greatest speakers that the world has ever known in terms of his ability to do what I was talking about. I spent about a year in the mission home watching him on a daily basis, and while I could never do exactly the way he did, I tried to mimic as much of the things that he did and implement that helped me significantly over those 37 years in the bank. What about writing? Well, probably like some of you, I became quite proficient in terms of doing those assigned research reports. That was very typical in some of the economics class or some of the other classes. And after my master's degree at BYU, I got a terrific job at Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York, and my boss was the assistant treasurer. At that time, Eastman Kodak was really one of the foremost high-class business institutions in the country. And my boss gave me a little assignment to write, and I thought I'd written pretty well. Well, in a few hours, it came back to me with more red ink, much more red ink on it than there were black typewritten pages. And obviously, it became very clear that what we call business writing is entirely different than what I had been used to do in some of those research projects that I had done so many times. And what became evident was that particularly if you're writing a little memo to, say, a legislator on a particular piece of legislation, if it's longer than one page, it mostly just goes into the garbage can because they can't read a whole bunch of stuff. You're lucky if they pay attention and read to one page. And so I learned very quickly that first time, as well as numerous times afterwards and through the 37 years that I worked at the bank, that you start out by writing, and then you rewrite, and then you revise, and then you rewrite it again. And after about 6 or 8 times, you get down to a short, direct, understandable, influential piece that can impact those who read it. And that's really important. Well, number 4, I think, is something that we all understand, what I call just willing to work hard. In terms of the business world, it may not be that much more complicated than simply coming to work early and staying late. You'd be surprised how many people there are who literally, if they get there at 8 o'clock, they barely make it at 8 o'clock. Many times they're late and are very reluctant to stay late and do anything extra, even if it means something that needs to be done that day that, if not, is going to complicate somebody else's ability to do what they need to do tomorrow. I tried to make a practice on whatever I was asked to do that I would do it in a way that exceeded the expectations that had been given to me. Secondly, I tried to complete it before it was due, not by the time it was due. That's just what was expected. But I had it done before it was due. And in many of the things that I was involved in, there were, particularly if you're forecasting interest rates, there are many different opinions in some of those meetings as to people either agree or disagree with my forecast. So I would take the effort before those meetings to attempt to figure out what objections could there be, who would ask the tough questions, and I either had the answer or a way in which I could handle those objections for the people that may challenge the thing that I had presented. You may be asking yourself, am I really talking about the real world? Is this real life? Is this stuff possible? Maybe some of you can remember, maybe not, but one of the best examples of this thing that I'm talking about is not necessarily my experience, but John Stockton and Carl Malone. I don't know if any of you were around when those two arrived in Salt Lake, when Stockton was chosen. Actually, that decision was booed in the Salt Palace. Nobody had ever heard of John Stockton. And obviously, Karl Malone had been passed by at least 13 teams in terms of his draft position with the Utah Jazz. When they arrived, they were at best pretty average, just average ball players. But for some way, somehow, and I don't know whether those who were drafting realized, but it turned out that those two had not only a fanatical, but an obsessive effort to try to improve their abilities and to work hard. They had the feeling that the best way to succeed was simply to outwork the competition, to study one more hour after everybody else had gone to bed. That's the best way to get a good score on the test, is simply study an hour after everybody else has decided it's time to quit. That's what they did. And as you know, the end of the story is that not only did they become incredible, they're in the Hall of Fame, and furthermore, in my opinion, they probably are two of the 5 best basketball players that's ever been in the NBA. And so to wrap this up, I tried to know what was going on as best I could, but realistically, anytime I gave a forecast to my bosses, there probably was at least 100 or maybe even 1,000 economists in the United States who knew as much or more about this than I did. But if I could do right what I felt was accurate, and I combined it in a package that I had researched as diligently as I could, that I wrote it in a way that was impactful when somebody read it, that it was impacted by the way that I presented it, in the way that I spoke, that I knew that I could defend it because I had evaluated all of the other options, all of the other so-called top economists that other people were reading about. I had a chance to be successful if I were willing to do that. So those are my 4 points as it would relate to some of the things which I learned as the time that I had the opportunity, the great opportunity, which I loved as being a bank economist. Okay? What we'll do now is we'll spend about another 15 minutes. Briefly, I want to spend a little bit of time suggesting you as to how did we get into a situation where one political party so adamantly disagrees with the other that there is really almost a 100% diametrical opposition in terms of anything that would be proposed. How did this happen, and what maybe is going to occur because of it in the upcoming election? The first thing that you should note is that perhaps the most important monthly economic data that comes out each month is the jobs number, and that will be due tomorrow. Usually it's on the first Friday of each month. Because Friday, I believe, was the first day of the month, they delayed it till this coming one. But what happens in the morning not only will impact the perception in the stock market and the economy, but it could actually change the impact of how the election goes in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Perhaps a quick background as to how we got to this place. You may remember, it's easy to remember 1776, right? We all know what 1776 was. Another thing happened was that there was a book written by Adam Smith, which became the father of modern economics. And for a period of maybe that's 1776 up to the 1930s, it was sort of understood by those who were thinking about economics was that if an economy had flexible wages, flexible prices, flexible interest rates, which meant that they could go up and down, the economy, with each individual person acting under their own self-interest, guided as if it were Adam Smith's famous by an invisible hand, would enable the economy to find its balance that would lead to a full employment. That was kind of the economic orthodoxy that lasted up until 1930. Maybe some of you remember reading why that period of time it was also, economics was called the dismal science. It wasn't dismal under the notion that we would end up with a huge amount of unemployment or end up with revolutions that occurred like in Russia or other places like that. It was the notion that population would increase at a geometric ratio or really quickly. Food production would increase only arithmetically, and hence we would always end up with more people than we had food production, and hence we would be sort of destined to end up at a subsistence level. Well, as we know, if you've read through the periods in the 1800s, that sort of didn't happen. And so the idea, Thomas Malthus' idea of the dismal science sort of faded away until we got to the 1930s. And you all know what happened in the 1930s. It became clear that in a depression or a deflationary situation, that it was clearly possible that we could end up in a equilibrium situation that would not automatically change and go back to a full employment. At that time, there happened to be an economist in the continent, particularly England, named John Maynard Keynes, who made famous the idea that if the economy gets caught in one of those deflationary, highly unemployed equilibrium environments when business were not spending, consumers were not spending. Have any of you had stories from your grandfathers? In my case, it was my father who barely made it through the Great Depression. Consumers weren't spending, business weren't spending. It became John Maynard Keynes' thesis, of which we who studied the economics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, was that it became government's responsibility to step in and through deficit spending inject money into the economy as a way of trying to re-stimulate aggregate demand and enhance the economy. So that became a really sort of accepted idea, even though, as we now look back, at least in my opinion, the 1930s, while there were some ups and downs, some improvements, I personally don't believe that the efforts of the government, the New Deal, to implement Keynesian economics as a way of getting out of the Depression were very successful, and it wasn't until the Second World War that we actually got out of the Depression. And so then along comes John Kennedy, later Ronald Reagan, even George Bush, who decided that it was a better approach when the economy started to falter, and in neither of those three instances were we talking about depressions, but some weakness that would be reflective of what we might call a recession right now, that it was more effective to cut taxes on a permanent basis for not only individuals but also business taxes, And in all three of those instances, the economy responded dramatically and improved significantly. And so that sort of became known as supply-side economics, which was sort of partially derogatorily described as trickling down. In other words, we would reduce taxes, including business taxes, as a way of stimulating the demand by business to not only invest but to hire, trickling down from tax cuts, as in contrast with the what's called bubble-up economics. The Keynesian notion is that it would be better to inject money into the consumer side directly, and they would then create demand, which would then induce businesses to be able to hire. And so it was sort of bubble up versus trickle down. Well, you all know that 2 or 3 years ago, we got caught in a very, very miserable situation, which was created by a huge housing bubble. If we had 2 or 3 hours, we could talk about how many people made the huge mistakes as it would relate to creating that situation. And when it culminated, it essentially came this close. We don't know exactly how close, but it came close enough to essentially destroying the total financial situation. And so at the end of Bush's term, we had the infamous TORP program, where they decided that they would inject some money into the economy. Initially, they were going to buy a bunch of bad mortgage-backed securities to try to take those out of the banks as a way of saving the financial industry. Later on, they decided that wouldn't work, so they were going to inject capital into the banks. And not only that, so we had the Bear Stearns fail, Lehman fail, AIG, Merrill Lynch was purchased by Bank America. We bought, Wells Fargo bought Wachovia. Chase bought, who's the mortgage banker up in the Northwest? Help me. Washington Mutual. And so that was kind of what happened. And so, of course, the election was clear that and people were really upset with this situation and wanted a change. And so we know the results of how that change occurred, and President Barack Obama and the administration swept in with a major election victory. The point that I want to draw to your attention is that much of what has occurred over the past 2 years has been clearly oriented towards following the Keynesian model of believing that the problem was deficient demand expended throughout the entire economy, and that tax cuts on business would be so-called tax cuts for the rich, which were adamantly opposed by this administration. And so what we've had is a series of events over the past 2 years which have attempted to inject money in the economy via the Keynesian approach to try to stimulate demand from the bottom up as a way of improving the economy. It's very evident from, if you take time to read the front side of that page, that this approach has had minimal, if any, success in terms of its ability to create jobs and improve the economy. At the same time, the Federal Reserve, which down at the very bottom of that page, which is the Wells Fargo, the very bottom, those lines show the interest rates. And you know that in our country, the Federal Reserve is the nation's central bank, which is intended to be independent and not be part of the administration or any particular governmental program. We didn't have to reflect back on just the Great Depression to see what mess we were teetering on. We had the experience of what occurred in Japan 20, 25 years ago, that after their real estate bubble, they acted timidly in terms of dealing with the situation, and they got caught in a deflationary credit crunch downward spiral that has now lasted for perhaps 25 years. If you want to know what's happened over Japan over the last 25 years, just presume that the situation that we're in today, in our country right now, were to persist for the next 25 years. That's what's happened to Japan. And so as try to avoid some of the mistakes that Japan made, the Fed moved quickly and aggressively to try to stimulate the economy through, first of all, what the Fed does is lower short-term interest rates. And so they drove those short-term interest rates down to essentially zero. That's the line which is called the Fed funds target rate. You can see it varies somewhere between 0 or 25 basis points. That's 1/4%. But there's not much that the Fed can do. Once you get to zero, there's not much further that you can go. And so the Fed has a very unique situation. If the Treasury wants to spend money, they have to do what? They either have to tax it to get money, or they have to borrow it from somebody, namely right now, the Chinese primarily, but they cannot print money, as it were, to be able to induce economic improvement. But the Fed, as the nation's central bank, can simply create money out of thin air. And the way they do that is they don't actually print dollar bills and throw them out of a helicopter and float down. They end up using the Federal Reserve balance sheet to buy securities in the open market. And over the past 2 years, they actually have purchased something as much as $1.6 or $1.7 trillion worth of money called quantitative easing. In other words, if the interest rates are down to zero, the way that they further ease in helping the economy is through this quantitative easing of, in effect, printing money and buying securities. Right now, there is a huge argument going on. The Fed seems intent on the idea that they should move back aggressively to expand that quantitative easing and maybe do as much as maybe another $500 billion of buying government securities or mortgage-backed securities and inject that money, again created out of thin air, but money created into the economy. But there's a real problem of doing that. Have any of you happened to notice over the past week what the market's reaction of this situation? First of all, long-term interest rates, which are the basis of determining mortgage rates, are falling. If you look on the very bottom line, the 10-year Treasury rate this morning is now down below 2.4%, which probably means mortgage rates are somewhere in the 4.25 or 4 3/8 range, an incredible low interest rate. And so the Fed believes that knowing that they can't absolutely just lower long-term interest rates like they can short-term interest rates, they want to inject more money in the economy through quantitative easing to try to lower and push down those long-term interest rates as a way of trying to reinvigorate some activity in the nation's housing market. There are certain segments of the housing market that maybe we could argue have stabilized and stopped falling. But there are very many others, including some prices of the more expensive homes, the whole foreclosure items that have not hit bottom yet, and we may be facing 3, 4, who knows how many years ahead of us in terms of this difficult housing situation. And so doesn't it make perfect sense for the Fed to inject another $500 billion into the economy as a way of pushing down long-term interest rates to help solve the housing market faster? Unfortunately, there are some other people who are watching this situation. The Fed's trying very hard to keep us from falling into the Japanese disease, that is, of getting locked in a deflationary credit crunch environment that just never goes away. But by doing what they are anticipating doing, we are now seeing the value of the dollar, our currency, whenever the Fed injects much more money into the economy, it's just regular supply and demand, the value of our currency is starting to fall, and because oil prices are denominated in dollars, what's happening to oil prices? They're jumping. Today they've leveled off a little bit today, but yesterday we were in the $82, $83 range. Now, we're a long ways from the $140 to $145 a barrel for crude that existed a couple of 3 years ago. I don't know if any of you were paying attention to that, but that was a disaster in terms of the impact on consumer confidence and consumer demand. And so can you imagine if we're sitting here right now with no business confidence in terms of their ability to trust government programs, trust what might be coming down the pike in terms of regulation or programs to redistribute income, raising taxes, this whole issue of whether to extend the Bush tax cut. It was just a travesty in my mind that the Congress left before they voted on that issue as to what's, we have no idea. Through up and down many aspects of the economy, whether or not what kind of tax rates we are going to face in the first part of next year, and the Congress walks away because they knew one side didn't have enough to pass it, the other side, of course, didn't have a chance of passing it, and so they just walked away. And so in the meantime, we're sitting here now in a situation where job creation is nil. If it turns out in the morning, if this number is a bit ugly, that is higher, if the unemployment rate goes higher and jobs are less than what the market expects, it could be a rather difficult situation, and of course it will only aggravate the perception that the economic policies of the past 2 years have not worked and have moved in the wrong direction. And so right now, it's a difficult situation. I would just tell you that I don't believe, I mean, it's, if you add up all the stuff that the administration has injected into the economy, we're probably in the $1.5 to $2 trillion. The Fed, as I've already told you, has put in probably at least $1.5 to $2 trillion of new money. I mean, with that amount of money being put into the economy in effectively a zero interest rate environment, it's pretty hard to imagine that the bottom is going to fall out of the economy totally. So I'm not of the opinion that we're teetering on the verge of another double dip where we actually begin to seriously fall. But we are clearly in a situation, unless there is some major change in terms of how we implement economic policy, that we are in a situation where if there ends up being gridlock in Washington, by gridlock means that the administration will be of one of those persuasions, the Congress may be in a different persuasion, which means that there won't be any way, if they don't decide to compromise and come together, there won't be really anything to get anything seriously done. We may teeter for at least another 2, 3, 4 years that would look very similar to where we are here today. Now, is that falling into the Japanese disease? I hope that we're not as bad or as long or as difficult as what Japan got caught in. But basically, we are in a difficult environment. In my opinion, many of the things which have been done in Washington have not only not worked, but have induced much uncertainty, and have actually inhibited the decisions to invest and to hire, and therefore we face this kind of a situation, and we'll just have to see what the people believe. What the people believe is the best way to proceed forward, and that's why we have elections. Thank you very much. It looks like we have maybe 6, 7, 8 minutes. So why don't we discuss whether or not you believe any of that stuff that I've told you? Who wants to talk? Yes, go ahead. Talk loud.
With Congress coming back from this, this whatever test that they're taking after the elections, and if some of the polls are correct, and Republicans take maybe 100 seats, right? That's what the extreme has projected. If that's the case, and Republicans come into the vast majority of the power, what in your mind would be some of the top 5 priorities that they should enact?
The important thing, I could quickly tell you the priorities. The important thing, and maybe even if they take both the House and the Senate, they could potentially pass them. But if the president decides that he is not going to move to the center like Clinton did, none of those priorities can become law, because there's no way they could override a presidential veto. And so it's irrelevant what those priorities are, because they can pass laws. Maybe they could, on the health care bill, they might be able to decide that they won't fund it. But that's a pretty radical situation to simply say that we won't fund something. And so basically, as it would relate to the taxes, the notion that we're hearing, I guess believing, is that in a lame duck session, again, depending upon how the election comes, we're going to have people who have just been defeated by the people in an election making a decision that impacts the economy and our ability to create jobs going forward, making those decisions in some kind of a lame duck session. It's just enough to make you cry. Yes?
In your opinion, what's the time lag from the time all this quantitative easing takes place and we see the full ramifications of the valuation of our dollar and inflation taking place?
Well, it's happening right now. That's a really good question, and if we had a couple of hours, we could explore all the ramifications. Obviously, inflation is not a problem in general right now. Deflation is a bigger worry in terms of the overall economy. So basically, what we're worried about is the possibility of having the impacts of deflation hampering our economy, and then at the same time, because of the weak dollar and hence rising oil prices, be impacted by not broad-based inflation. Usually if you have broad-based inflation, you've got somebody who's willing to buy or invest or do something because of the inflation. We would have the impacts of deflation combined with rising gasoline and oil prices, which would be, we might say the worst of all worlds. And so there's no complete evidence right now that even if the Fed does that second round of quantitative easing, that even if they're successful in lowering long-term interest rates another quarter, it may or may not have any impact in terms of immediacy effect on the economy. So for me to conjecture when it's going to work, we don't even know it's going to work at all, let alone the time frame as to when it might work. Yes. Both of you, either one, go ahead.
Who do you see as other countries or even other states that are being responsible that unfortunately we're not to be emulated anymore, although some people do consider the United States as kind of the best of the worst. Who do you see
Well,
as a good example of economic?
again, that question requires much more time than we have right now. But some of the countries right now that are doing the best, or like the Australias and the Canadas, and we know why are they doing better, because they got a lot of natural resources, and those are some of the things. The one thing that I would point out to you, however, is that in terms of job growth, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just the other day that showed that among even the Western European economies, many, and some of the problems in Europe are really, really bad. I mean, if you want to know what we could get our mess into, if we want to expand debt to the point that we simply can't service that debt, just look at Greece, just look at the state of California. There's a lot of examples out there of what happens when you increase debt to the point that you cannot service it. But in terms of many countries, we are actually among the worst in terms of being able to start growing jobs. We're not even average. We're definitely not the highest. We're some of the slowest. The amount of employment improvement that we've incurred over the last 2 years puts us near the bottom.
With the financial reform bill, when it came out and there was no mention of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, why was there not more of an outcry from the private sector saying, hey, they had shared blame and what happened?
Well, in my opinion, it was just an absolute disastrous force to presume that anyone was going to have a financial reform bill and completely ignore Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If you want to know why it was that way, it was simply a political decision that they knew, they knew they didn't want to try to address that situation. Many of the people who were in power on the Democratic side were big supporters and actually helped generate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to be in the situation that they were in. And so for a bill to be passed that was intended to be a financial reform package that ignored Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you can just immediately know how what's the word, how sincere or how complete it really was. It was just, obviously I wasn't a big fan of that bill. Are we done? One more? Quick, okay. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering if you hypothetically had all power, what economic policies would you implement?
Well, the first thing I would do would be definitely renew all the Bush tax cuts. Now, we know that the deficit is huge and there's a fairly big amount of impact on the deficit because of those tax cuts, which means that we are going to have to get serious about the deficit. Well, we've heard that as long as you've been alive, as long as I've been alive. But at some point, if you look at the Greeces and the Californias and any numbers of places, we are simply going to have to do something relative to the deficits. Unfortunately, most of the deficit problem are tied into entitlements. Do you know what I mean by entitlements? If we treat all of those entitlements as sacred cows, we are never going to solve the problem. But if we start talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, this new program, who knows what this new health care will end up doing. If we treat those as sacred cows, we may as well just, if we basically did away with all the rest of the federal government other than those entitlements, we still wouldn't solve the problem. And so in the meantime, I don't know. I don't even as strong a leader as Ronald Reagan was, I mean, you just have a very hard time to get reelected if you're going to start talking about those entitlement programs. And so I don't know whether we, the people, have had enough of a scare and to realize that we've dug ourselves in a hole that we must find a way out of, and the only way to seriously get out of is to address the entitlement programs, whether we, the people, will decide that solving the entitlement programs or adjusting the entitlement programs is worth protecting our economy, or whether we still treat it as an untouchable in terms of getting reelected. We'll just have to see how the politics play out. Thank you very much.
Well, we'd like to thank Dr. Matthews for coming today and for sharing those insights about both his experience and the economy. And we look forward to having him around here on campus throughout the following year or the upcoming year. And it's just a small token of our appreciation. We have a gift for you. Thank you very much.